Have you ever paused to wonder why the Jewish people representing such a tiny minority globally leave such an enormous mark on history, culture, and science? Take a moment to consider this fascinating reality. On this planet, filled with diversity and contrasts, over 8 billion people call Earth home. We represent a tapestry of ethnicities, skin tones, faiths, beliefs, and traditions. Yet among this vast multitude, merely 16 million individuals identify as Jewish. 1% of our global population. 16 million. This raises an unavoidable question that demands exploration. How could such a small group create such a profound impact on humanity? Here's a statistic that will leave you thinking deeply. Among the world's wealthiest individuals listed by Forbes, nearly half of the top 10 have Jewish heritage. Is this mere coincidence? Or does this reveal something much deeper that deserves our careful attention? Roughly 20% of Nobel Prize recipients are Jewish, a remarkable percentage when we consider their global proportion. Are we witnessing a simple statistical quirk, or does this reflect something much greater, a culture that treasures knowledge, resilience, and collective determination? If this has already sparked your curiosity, stay with me until this video's conclusion, because we're going to explore these questions thoroughly, uncover hidden secrets, and understand what makes this people so remarkable. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Trust me, what you're about to discover could transform how you view history and even your own life. This isn't just about cold statistics, it's about seeing the faces behind these numbers. Consider this. Individuals like Maya Plisetskaya, a dancer so unique and graceful that her artistry continues receiving worldwide acclaim. Steven Spielberg, a cinematic master who revolutionized how we understand storytelling on the big screen. Natalie Portman, a talented and beautiful actress who not only shines in Hollywood, but also graduated with honors in psychology from Harvard. Behind every name lies a story of discipline, passion, and a relentless pursuit to leave their mark. We cannot forget Albert Einstein, a name that resonates as a synonym for brilliance, someone who altered physics laws and transformed how we comprehend the universe. Or Paul Ehrlich, a brilliant physician who pioneered treatments for devastating diseases like leukemia, diphtheria, and tuberculosis, while also discovering the first effective treatment for syphilis, saving countless lives. And certainly there's Pink, whose real name is Alicia Moore, a versatile artist who blends music, rebellion, and a distinctive voice. How can we not mention Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, who revolutionized psychology forever with his theories about the human mind? This pattern isn't coincidental. It's a chain of examples that forces you to reflect on what lies behind so much talent, creativity, and impact on humanity. Could it be a combination of history, culture, family tradition, and deeply rooted values? Perhaps it's proof of how perseverance, education, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge can transform a small group into a people who influence the entire world. The list of names stretches endlessly. While we've mentioned several, the truth is that behind each one stand hundreds, thousands more who have contributed something valuable to humanity across different fields. From medicine to physics, from art to cinema, from music to psychology, the Jewish people's footprint is as profound as it is surprising. If you haven't considered this yet, perhaps it's time to pause and reflect on what this phenomenon means. It's no secret that Jewish achievements are recognized worldwide. One need only observe their presence in science, art, economics, and culture to realize something distinguishes them. This gives rise to that widespread perception that all Jews are wealthy and brilliant. Does this stereotype contain some truth? Let's dig deeper to understand where this idea originates and why it seems life smiles more favorably on Jews than other peoples. To answer that, as always, we must look backward, return to the origin. Who are the Jews, really? Opening any encyclopedia, we find they are a people of Semitic origin, descendants of ancient tribes who inhabited the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in biblical times. Today, Jews live throughout the world, from the United States to Argentina, across Europe, and, of course, Israel. At first glance, we might think they're like any other ethnic group, with their culture, language, and traditions. But history isn't that simple. The question is, why do Jews consider themselves a chosen people? What does that actually mean? The answer lies in their sacred texts. The Hebrew Bible, known by Christians as the Old Testament, or Tanakh for Jews, is clear on this matter. The Jewish people were chosen by God, the universe's creator, to fulfill a special purpose. This is where the entire narrative that has shaped their identity across millennia begins. According to the Bible, after the flood that devastated the earth in Noah's time, humanity decided to unite to build a tower so tall it would reach heaven. This was the Tower of Babel, a symbol of human pride, the desire for limitless self-aggrandizement. But God, or Yahweh, as called in Hebrew tradition, observed what men were doing and was not pleased at all. Why? Because they were attempting to achieve greatness without acknowledging their Creator, forgetting who gave them life and challenging His authority. To halt that excessive pride, God made a radical decision. He confused their languages, making each group speak a different tongue. Thus humanity, which until then understood itself as one voice, was divided into peoples, cultures, and nations. The tower remained unfinished, people scattered across the earth, and a diversity of languages emerged that persists today. However, although God dispersed men, He didn't forget His promise to Noah. He would never destroy all humanity again, even if human wickedness increased. Instead of annihilating, He chose to form a people who would be an example, a model for the rest. Here appears Abraham, a man who stood out among all others for his obedience, his unshakable faith, and his willingness to follow the divine calling. Abraham wasn't just any man. He was someone willing to leave everything, to depart from his land, to sacrifice his own plans to fulfill the purpose God had for him and his descendants. Abraham's calling wasn't just to bless him personally, but so that through his lineage the nations of the earth could be blessed. This is the root of the chosen people concept. It's not about superficial favoritism, but a calling to a mission, to be light for the nations, an example of faith, obedience, and fidelity to the Creator. This narrative, deeply rooted in Jewish identity, has been a force that has driven generations to pursue knowledge, to persevere amid adversity, and to maintain a sense of purpose beyond circumstances. Clearly, that mindset transmitted from parents to children across centuries has produced visible fruits. Scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, thinkers, musicians, leaders, all leaving their mark on history, not by chance but as a result of a cultural heritage that pushes them not to conform, to always seek a greater purpose. Do you realize now why it's so common to hear that Jews are successful, intelligent, or even chosen? History, beliefs, and culture have woven a network that, generation after generation, continues producing surprising results. According to biblical tradition, the Lord made a promise to Abraham that would mark entire generations' destiny. From him would be born a great and powerful nation, and it would be precisely among that people where the Savior of all humanity would come into the world. Most astonishing is that this divine covenant was made long before Abraham even had a son, before there existed even the first seed of what would become the nation of Israel. The Jewish people were already in the Creator's plans, chosen for a special mission. Do you realize how profound this is? Before anything else, before any conquest or mistake, an entire people's destiny was already written in God's hands. But here comes something many overlook. That calling, that privilege, also came with a price. Abraham's almost naive trust, his willingness to rely completely on God's word, has been a burden the Jewish people have carried on their shoulders for centuries. History teaches a forceful lesson. Every time human beings try to put themselves on God's level, believing themselves self-sufficient or superior, consequences don't take long to arrive and are rarely good. What did God really expect from Abraham? A simple man of flesh and blood? Nothing less than total surrender. He asked him to abandon his home, leave everything he knew, and launch into an uncertain destiny, wandering through unknown lands, facing hunger, thirst, dangers, and the solitude of one who lives by faith and not by sight. It wasn't easy. Every step was a test, and Yahweh didn't stop there. He put Abraham before challenges that would test that order that chills the blood. Sacrifice his son, the son for whom he had prayed, waited, and dreamed for years. Can you imagine being in that place? Having to choose between love for your son and absolute obedience to a divine command. Abraham, in an act of faith that defies all human logic, bound Isaac. He raised the knife with the intention to obey, even though it broke his heart. And at that moment, when tragedy seemed inevitable, an angel of God stopped his hand, and instead of his son, a ram was offered as sacrifice. Why did God do something so extreme? Because he wanted to make clear that Abraham's faith wasn't superficial, but deep, tested in fire, capable of passing the hardest of tests. It was a faith willing to surrender everything, even the most beloved. But the story doesn't end there. Before having moments of extreme hunger that forced him to seek refuge in Egypt, a land that wasn't his, where his family began to grow and multiply. It was amid those difficulties that the Jewish people were born, a people who would emerge in the sands of time as a fulfilled promise. Centuries passed, and this chosen people's path was full of ups and downs. We thus arrive at the Sinai Covenant, another key moment in Jewish history, where God would establish an alliance with his people in the desert's midst, giving them laws and commandments to guide their life as a nation. But that's a topic for another moment. Let's continue with this story's thread. Under Moses' leadership, the Israelites managed to break the chains of slavery in Egypt, and after a long, hard journey through the desert, they reached the imposing Mount Sinai. It was there where, according to Scripture, they had a direct encounter with God. Yahweh proposed a covenant to them. If they accepted to obey his commandments, he would recognize them as his special people, as his inheritance among all earth's nations. Some say this offer wasn't exclusive to Israel. According to certain traditions, the same God offered this alliance to other peoples. But it was the Hebrews who, with an act of faith and courage, gave the definitive yes. They were the first to accept that commitment. Now then, by accepting that covenant, did Yahweh immediately give them an easy, comfortable life full of privileges? Absolutely not. If we review historical records, we don't find that the Jewish people were superior in culture, military power, or wealth compared to other nations. In fact, they were often behind in social organization, technological advances, and even coexistence norms. In many cases, neighboring peoples like the Egyptians or Babylonians seemed far ahead in sophistication and material achievements. However, the people of Israel had something no other had. A promise that came directly from the Creator, made to Abraham centuries earlier. That was the root of their identity as chosen people. It wasn't about innate superiority, but a calling, a divine commitment that defined their purpose in the world. And here an inevitable question arises. Why precisely this people? Why them and not others? The complete answer only God knows. But if we look carefully, we can intuit some things. Perhaps it was precisely their history marked by extreme challenges that forged them as a resilient people. Maybe by choosing them, the Creator didn't give them easy privileges, but rather a life full of tests so they would learn to resist, to remain faithful, and to transmit their faith from generation to generation. Because if something characterizes the Jewish people, it's their capacity to resist adversity. Jewish history isn't just a chronicle of cultural, scientific, or religious achievements. It's above all the living testimony of an incessant struggle for survival. Throughout centuries, Jews have been persecuted, expelled, discriminated against, and forced to abandon places where they tried to settle. Every time they opened a business, founded a community, or began to prosper in a region, voices of hatred filled with prejudices appeared, seeking to silence and expel them. They were nomads, not because they wanted to be, but because time and again history pushed them forward, to seek a new place where they could live in peace. What was their homeland? Where was their true home? That question has accompanied them for centuries. To answer it, we must first understand something key. Where does God dwell on earth? According to tradition, God is in places that believers dedicate to Him, in temples, in synagogues, in churches, in mosques. For the Jewish people, that place was the majestic Temple of Jerusalem, a sacred site where pilgrims from around the world came to pray and offer sacrifices. But that temple, symbol of their faith and identity, didn't last forever. In the year 586 before our era, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon invaded Jerusalem, razed the city, and destroyed the first temple. Before that, he had already conquered Egypt and afterward easily subdued the small and weak kingdom of Judah. Those who survived the siege were taken as slaves to Babylon, and only a small group of poor farmers stripped of everything remained in Judea. Why did this happen? According to the Bible, it wasn't a simple historical accident. It was a spiritual consequence. Jerusalem's fall and the temple's destruction were interpreted as divine judgment, a wake-up call to the people for having abandoned their principles, for having distanced themselves from faith, and for forgetting the covenant they had made with God at Sinai. It was, ultimately, a warning that no people, however chosen they may be, can prosper if they forget their purpose and distance themselves from their Creator. Do you realize the magnitude of this story? It's not just a chronicle of wars and kings, but a tale of faith, betrayal, redemption, and survival. A story that continues resonating to this day. According to historical and biblical accounts, there was a key moment in Jewish people's history that the Lord, irreversibly marked by His people's disobedience and moral corruption, allowed them to lose their land. It was like an inevitable consequence. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist, and Jews were taken captive to foreign lands, living under Babylonian rule for nearly 70 years. Imagine the weight of that sentence: losing your home, your identity as a nation, and seeing everything your ancestors fought for crumble. But we must understand the context. In that era, conquest wars were part of the usual landscape. Babylon, which seemed invincible, was also conquered, this time by the Persian Empire. And here's where history takes an unexpected turn. Cyrus, the great king of Persia, allowed Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. It was like a rebirth, a second chance to start anew, a return to the home that had been promised to their ancestors. But of course, the question that arises is, how long would that peace last? Would that return be definitive or just a respite before new storms? And now comes the detail few tell. Who was the true destroyer of the Jewish people's greatest sanctity? There's an interesting version to consider. After Jews returned and settled in Judah, they lived for a time in relative calm, but history, as always, didn't take long to twist. In the first century of our era, Rome was in full expansion, conquering territories throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. The province of Judea was no exception. It became one more under Roman Empire rule. At first, Roman emperors didn't interfere too much in Jewish religious affairs. They allowed them to continue worshiping their god Yahweh, but imposed an economic tribute and, as was customary, a show of loyalty. Honoring the emperor as a sacred figure. Most peoples conquered by Rome accepted these conditions without much problem. They paid their taxes, placed a small statue of the emperor on their altars, and continued with their lives. But not the Jewish people. They refused to worship a man because their faith taught them there was only one true God. Moreover, taxes were heavy, and constant oppression ignited the fire of resistance. It was then that a radical group emerged, willing to fight to the death. These men and women weren't simple rebels. They were fanatics willing to die for their faith, convinced that anyone who departed from God's law deserved to be eliminated, even if they were compatriots. There was no room for doubt or negotiation, and the situation became increasingly tense. When a Roman governor decided to plunder part of the temple's riches as punishment for rebellion, the zealots didn't sit idly by. They rose in arms, expelled Roman authorities from Jerusalem, and for a brief moment achieved an impressive victory, recovering their independence and liberating their land. It was as if entire generations' dream came true. People celebrated, shouted with joy, believed they would finally be free forever. But history isn't that simple, and freedom is often more fragile than it seems. Not much time passed before internal divisions began tearing apart the Jewish community itself, like embers in a dry field. The Zealots, increasingly radical, began persecuting those who dared question their extreme vision of faith. If someone dared to doubt, or worse yet, to stray from traditions, they were considered traitors and executed without mercy. They killed each other, brothers, neighbors, members of the same people. Thousands of people lost their lives at the hands of their own compatriots. It was a tragedy that weakened the nation just when they most needed to be united. Rome, of course, didn't waste the opportunity. Seeing the chaos consuming Jerusalem, Roman generals decided to act. They surrounded the city, established a relentless siege, and began a brutal campaign to suffocate the rebellion. And although Jerusalem was a fortified city with imposing walls, resisting Rome's power wasn't an easy task. Jerusalem's fate hung by a thread, and history was about to write one of its darkest chapters. Jerusalem, a fortified city like few in its time, was surrounded by imposing walls and towers that seemed to touch the sky. From outside it appeared impregnable, a proud fortress that defied the powerful Roman armies. However, within those walls, reality was much darker and more chaotic. Nearly 1 million people took refuge in the city hoping for protection. But Jerusalem didn't have resources to feed so many. Hunger began devouring hope, and fear settled like a shadow in every corner. Most tragic is that danger didn't come only from external enemies. Within the walls, true hell was unleashed by the zealots themselves. These groups of religious fanatics, instead of uniting the people to resist together, began fighting for power. They raided common citizens' houses, stole the few remaining foods, and watched with hawk eyes that no one tried to open the city gates to negotiate with Romans or even escape seeking refuge. For the zealots, surrendering was treason, and they preferred to see their people die rather than yield an inch. Fear was double. Not only did they have to fear the enemy outside, but also the fanatics inside. Finally, when Roman troops managed to break the defenses and entered the city, what they found left them horrified. The spectacle was dantesque. A population devastated by hunger, bodies scattered in the streets, and an uncontrollable fire consuming Jerusalem's sacred temple, the most precious jewel of the Jewish people. How had that fire begun? Here, history becomes even more tragic. Amid chaos, when defeat was already imminent, a fleeing zealot, in a final act of desperation or perhaps extreme fanaticism, threw a lit torch against the temple. Maybe he did it as a cry of rage, as a message that if they couldn't maintain their sanctuary, no one else would have it. It was the height of destruction. Their own people, blinded by fury, finished consuming what they had defended so much. The question is inevitable. How did the chosen people, the repository of a divine promise, reach such a dark point? It was the extremists themselves who set fire to their temple, dragged the people into bloody wars, and ultimately caused the loss of their land and freedom. This isn't just an anecdote from the past. It's a painful lesson about what happens when fanaticism and division blind reason and destroy community bonds. Although many records indicate that Romans destroyed Jerusalem's temple, the truth is more complex. The fire was lit by Jewish hands themselves, and that's something history cannot erase. The sanctuary was reduced to ashes, and with it a key chapter in Israel's history was extinguished, leaving a scar that still hurts in their people's collective memory. Do you realize how profound this story is? It's not just about wars, battles, or conquests. It's a mirror of human nature, of what we're capable of doing, even against ourselves, when we let fear, hatred, and pride consume us. Worth reflecting on, don't you think? From that majestic Jerusalem temple, symbol of Jewish people's faith and identity, only a fragment remained, a solitary wall that has survived the passage of centuries. That wall, known today as the Wailing Wall, is much more than an archaeological vestige. It's a living testimony of resistance, a place where faith persists despite tragedy. Thousands of people from all parts of the world make pilgrimages there seeking comfort, praying for their loved ones, remembering those who have departed, and leaving messages of hope between the cracks in the stones. It's also a scene of solemn acts. There, official ceremonies of the State of Israel are celebrated, Holocaust commemorations, and religious events that connect the present with a millennial past of struggle, pain, and unshakable faith. The Holocaust, that heartbreaking chapter of history, we'll examine in detail later. For now, let's return to the devastating image: Jerusalem in ruins, its temple destroyed, its people without a place to call home. The sadness, pain, and desolation that enveloped the Jewish people in those times are difficult to put into words. They had lost their land, their spiritual center, and now had no choice but to scatter. Thus began the diaspora, an exodus that would extend for 1,000 years, taking the Jewish people to the world's most remote corners. That's why, to this day, you can find Jewish communities in almost any country, from Europe to America, from Asia to Africa. It's not coincidence. It's the result of centuries of forced migration, constant adaptation to new lands, languages, and cultures. But being a people without their own land was never easy. Wherever they arrived, Jews were viewed with suspicion. They were the others, the foreigners, the different ones. Often they were unjustly accused of being responsible for society's ills, pointed out as scapegoats for political, economic, or social crises. From childhood, they were taught that the only way to make their way in a hostile world was through effort, ingenuity, education. They learned to do much with little, to prosper even amid extreme adversities. That work ethic and ability to adapt became a distinctive mark of the Jewish people, but also a source of envy and resentment for many. In many places, Jews were forced to perform specific trades or provide services others avoided. It wasn't rare for local leaders, kings, or nobles to turn to Jews for loans. However, when time came to pay debts, anti-Semitism served as a convenient tool. Instead of returning money, they accused them of conspiring, corrupting, destabilizing social order. It was a brutally effective strategy. Declare Jews enemies of the state, confiscate their goods, and force them to abandon the city or even the country within hours. Sometimes they weren't given more than a day to gather what little they could carry, reunite their families, children, elderly, pregnant women, and march to an uncertain destiny, leaving behind their homes, businesses, dreams, and of course they couldn't protest. They were in foreign lands, in borrowed homes, without real rights, always at the mercy of power's whims. This pattern of expulsions, persecutions, and exiles repeated time and again throughout centuries, leaving a deep scar in Jewish people's collective memory. Yet that same adversity forged a strong, resilient identity. capable of reinventing itself again and again in every place where they had to start from zero. In 10th century Europe, Jews began being seen as pariahs, excluded and marginalized in most Christian societies. They were labeled heretics, accused of not accepting the dominant faith, and prohibited from owning land, which left them out of the economic base that sustained others. Often, the professions they could practice were limited or directly vetoed. Jews became the easy target to blame when things went wrong. If a harvest failed, if diseases struck, if the economy collapsed, there were the Jews to bear the blame. It became a perverse cycle. In times of peace, they were needed for their knowledge and skills. In times of crisis, they were pointed out as the cause of all evils. A brutal example of this irrational hatred occurred during the Black Death, that devastating pandemic that swept Europe in the 14th century. Dark rumors spread like poison in the squares. They said Jews poisoned wells to exterminate Christians. This collective delirium ignited a wave of pogroms, a chain of massacres and expulsions that left brutality across Europe. The Jewish people resisted. Their spirit didn't break. Their culture didn't disappear. Again and again they rose from ashes, and not only survived, they innovated. Did you know Jews were the first in Italy to develop glass and paper production? Yes, that's right. Amid an adverse context, they found ways to create something valuable. But of course, that creativity also awakened the powerful's envy. As soon as authorities learned of these advances, they closed factories and confiscated workshops. Not content with that, they began forcing them to live in special neighborhoods, the ghettos. These were separate areas, walled zones where Jewish families were confined almost like prisoners within their own communities. Ghettos weren't just a physical place, they were a declaration of contempt. They were spaces marked by poverty, overcrowding, extreme deprivation, and severe rules that limited daily life. Streets were narrow, houses small and crowded, and surveillance was constant. It wasn't just about separating, but humiliating, making clear that Jews didn't belong to the rest of society. They were considered the others, the unwanted. Every restriction, every wall, every special tax, every prohibition was a reminder of that exclusion. The Jewish people found ways to resist. They learned to preserve their identity, to educate their children in secret, to continue with their traditions, even though the world wanted to silence them. And that's something history can never erase. A people who even in the most adverse circumstances never stopped dreaming of being free again. But not even by locking Jews in ghettos could authorities rest easy. It was as if this people's mere existence was a thorn that constantly bothered the powerful. Why not simply expel them once and for all? Why not remove them not just from a city, but from an entire country, or better yet, from all of Europe? That was the thinking circulating in power's corridors. However, there was an uncomfortable problem. The Jewish people had valuable knowledge that society couldn't afford to lose. They were doctors, healers, astronomers, accountants, and a large part of the taxes sustaining cities' coffers came directly or indirectly from Jewish communities' economic activity. Getting rid of them meant losing money, talent, and essential services. So, what to do with this contradiction? How to maintain control without sacrificing the advantages they provided? After mulling over the matter, what some called the solution emerged. Isolate them even more. Italy's government made the decision to concentrate the entire Jewish population in one place, away from the rest of society. They moved them to the islet of Cannaregio, where they built a special neighborhood they called Ghetto Nuovo, which literally means new furnace or new foundry, as if they were metals that needed to be melted or molded. In that place, Jews lived under strict conditions, almost like animals in a cage. They were prohibited from owning property, buying land, or engaging in artistic activities like painting, sculpture, or music. It was as if Jewish creativity was a threat that had to be contained. Leaving the ghetto walls was almost impossible. Only in exceptional cases and with justified reason could they cross its borders. But even in those moments they had to wear special hats and yellow badges on clothing, marks designed so anyone could identify them at first sight. Discrimination was visible, shameless, and cruel. These symbols not only marked them as different, but reduced them to a caricature, to a stigmatized image before society's eyes. And it wasn't just Italy. Russia also followed the same line of exclusion and contempt. At the end of the 15th century, the Russian Empire government implemented the so-called Pale of Settlement, an invisible border that delimited zones where Jews could live. Jews were prohibited from settling outside those areas, especially in large cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other important urban centers. It was like telling them, "You can exist, but not here, not among us." They were denied the right to fully integrate into society, to access growth opportunities, to be part of the most influential city's economic and cultural fabric. This marginalization system not only impoverished them materially, but also sent them a clear message. They weren't part of us. They were foreigners, even in the land where they were born. Despite everything, the Jewish people resisted with ingenuity, effort, impressive resilience. They managed to survive, raise their children, keep their traditions alive, and move forward, even though the world seemed bent on closing all doors to them. For centuries, Jews were victims of systematic and brutal discrimination that placed them in a position of almost total disadvantage in societies where they lived. They were restricted from the most basic rights. They couldn't hold government positions. They were excluded from many universities, and when they managed to open a business, they faced obstacles and discrimination that closed doors to prosperity. Even to access higher education, limiting quotas existed. They couldn't exceed 5% of total enrollment, a policy known as the infamous numerus clausus. This type of measure denied them opportunities to grow, to train, to contribute fully to society, creating an artificial gap that fed resentment and perpetuated exclusion. In the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, that hostility transformed into open violence. Waves of pogroms unleashed, massive attacks where enraged crowds beat, looted, and murdered Jews, while authorities at best looked the other way and at worst encouraged them to act. Houses were burned, shops destroyed, and entire families were murdered simply for being Jewish. But most atrocious of all was the spread of monstrous slanders, like accusations that Jews kidnapped Christian children to murder them in secret rituals. This completely false myth fed hatred and justified cold-blooded massacres, sowing terror in Jewish communities throughout Europe. Jews were treated as if they were second-class beings, as if they weren't people worthy of rights or respect. They were seen as enemies, as a threat, as a cancer that should be removed from society. However, all this violence, all this injustice only revealed a much greater danger. The poison of ignorance, fanaticism. Anti-Semitism wasn't just a tragedy for Jews, but a warning for all humanity about the horrors that can arise when prejudice and lies are accepted as truths. And so we arrive at the darkest page of this story, the Holocaust. The word of Greek origin means completely burned, and Jews know it as Shoah, which in Hebrew means the catastrophe. It was a systematic and deliberate attempt to annihilate an entire people, carried out by the Nazi regime wasn't simply to oppress or discriminate against them, and 1945, but to exterminate them, to erase any trace of their existence from the face of the earth. But why did this leader feel such hatred for Jews? The answer is complex, but partly due to the Nazi ideology he himself promoted, a distorted and poisonous vision that defended the existence of a single pure race, the Aryan race, free from any contamination. For this leader, Jews were seen as a threat to that purity, as an internal enemy that had to be eradicated to build the empire he dreamed of. This racial superiority delirium fed a death machine that would end up murdering more than 6 million Jews, including children, women, elderly, and innocent people who only had one thing in common: being Jewish. The Holocaust wasn't just genocide. It was a brutal warning of how far humanity can go when hatred is fed, when lies become weapons, and when indifference allows violence to grow without limits. A wound that still hurts, a reminder that fanaticism must never be tolerated, and an urgent call to memory and commitment to truth and justice. In the Nazi regime's distorted vision, anyone who didn't fit their ideal of racial perfection simply had no place within that exclusion scheme. Jews became the most targeted group. They were different. They didn't follow the same customs, didn't share the same faith, didn't seem to adapt to the mold that this leader and his party wanted to impose. In Nazis' brutal logic, if they're not like us, then they shouldn't exist. But why that specific obsession with the Jewish people? Why focus on them as primary enemies? The answer has several layers. To begin with, after Germany's defeat in World War I, many sought a culprit, someone to blame for national humiliation, territorial losses, and the economic crisis that plunged the country into chaos. Blaming Jews was a convenient excuse, though profoundly unjust. Ironically, many Jews had fought in frontline trenches during the war, shoulder to shoulder with their German compatriots. There were Jewish soldiers, officers, and even generals who had given their lives for Jews Germany, who held responsible positions in government, economy, sciences. However, that didn't prevent them from being pointed out as scapegoats. The Nazi Party, with its relentless propaganda machine, took charge of feeding that hatred using incendiary speeches and lies carefully designed to manipulate masses. This leader knew exactly how to exploit people's resentment, how to transform collective frustration into concentrated hatred toward a common enemy. Jews became the perfect target. They were different, visible, an easy minority to attack. Moreover, a sinister narrative was woven around them. But there was an even deeper reason, a paranoia that nested in this leader's mind. The belief that Jews, having no land of their own, were scattered across the world and formed a secret network, an international conspiracy to dominate the planet from shadows. For the Nazi leader, Jews were the main adversary in his struggle for global power, and that obsession led him to declare total war against them. This sick fantasy, repeated ad nauseum in his speeches, gradually penetrated many people's mentality, not only in Germany but in other countries too. People began believing Jews were behind every problem, every crisis, every defeat, and hatred grew like a flame fueled by ignorance and fear. The first anti-Semitic pogroms in Germany emerged in 1933, just as this leader came to power. They weren't part of a detailed plan initially, but the atmosphere was already so charged with hatred that violence exploded almost spontaneously. Jewish rights began being curtailed. They were prohibited from working in certain sectors. They were denied access to public positions. They were separated from cultural life and gradually isolated from society. Some, seeing what was coming, managed to escape, leaving behind their homes, businesses, and entire lives. But others, perhaps from fear, hoped that things would improve, or simply because they couldn't imagine abandoning their land, decided to stay. And for many of them, that decision was a death sentence. History once again repeated itself. A persecuted people, expelled and singled out for the simple fact of being different. A tragedy that had begun centuries earlier and in the 20th century reached a level of horror the world would never forget. Here it's important to clarify a key point often overlooked. Initially, this leader didn't have complete extermination of Jews as his main plan. It may seem hard to believe, but at first what the dictator really wanted was to use Jews as cheap labor, as a reserve of obedient and intelligent slaves. Because yes, although Nazi discourse painted them as a threat, they also knew that within the Jewish people were many individuals with talent, knowledge, and valuable skills that could be exploited for the Third Reich's benefit. This leader's initial project was more of an isolation strategy. His intention was to create ghettos in distant places, especially in Poland, or even on Madagascar Island, where Jews would be confined, separated from the rest of the world. Later, with Nazi empire expansion eastward, the plan was to deport millions of people, not just Jews, but all conquered peoples, toward Siberia's inhospitable lands, where they would be used as forced labor to sustain the German war machine. But plans changed drastically when the anti-Nazi coalition formed, an international alliance determined to defeat this leader and liberate countries occupied by the fascist regime. It was then that the Nazi leadership made a monstrous decision. It was no longer enough to isolate or displace the Jewish people. Now they had to be completely eradicated. Thus began the Holocaust's darkest phase, the systematic extermination of an entire people. And here a disturbing question arises. Who was directly responsible for this order? Where is the official document? The paper with this leader's signature, the Red Seal, and detailed instructions. The answer is as terrifying as it is frustrating. Nazi genocide wasn't an operation with an explicit document. No formal decree. It was a death machine set in motion almost like an open secret, driven by ideology, fanaticism, and blind obedience. It wasn't common soldiers directing this massacre, but men with academic titles, doctors, scientists, people who had studied at Germany's best universities. They wore white coats, had doctorates, but used their knowledge not to heal, but to destroy human lives. How is it possible that these educated men didn't understand the magnitude of horror they were committing? How could they look their victims in the eyes and continue forward as if nothing happened? Initially, Nazis resorted to the most direct and brutal method: mass shootings. Groups of men, women, and children were lined up and executed by gunfire in fields and forests, in ditches and ravines. But soon, Heinrich Himmler, chief of the feared SS, reached a cold and calculating conclusion. Each bullet costs money, and there are still too many Jews. That thought, loaded with terrifying cruelty, marked the beginning of a perverse search for more efficient methods to kill in large quantities, with less expense and greater speed. Thus, the extermination machinery evolved toward concentration camps and gas chambers, where murder stopped being a wartime act and became an industrialized process, a death factory designed to erase millions of people as if they were simple waste. Do you realize how monstrous all this was? It wasn't just a crime against the Jewish people. It was a crime against all humanity, a moral abyss from which we're still trying to understand and learn so it never repeats itself. It was then that Nazis designed an extermination machine as ruthless as it was effective. They created 6 death camps in occupied Polish territories, true killing factories that had gas chambers capable of asphyxiating more than 2,000 people at once, and crematoria that operated day and night, devouring victims' bodies without rest. Most horrifying is that executioners didn't stop there. After murdering Jews, they appropriated all their belongings: gold from jewelry, precious stones, even dental crowns. Everything was collected, melted, and sent to Germany. Part of that blood-stained gold ended up in Swiss banks, in secret accounts belonging to high Nazi regime officials. It was systematic plundering of lives, dreams, and even the last material remains of their victims. When World War II ended, the world discovered the horror's magnitude. The Holocaust had taken with it 87% of Europe's Jewish population. Millions of men, women, and children had been annihilated just for belonging to a people. It seemed that after such tragedy, Abraham's people would resign themselves to oblivion, gradually extinguishing, dissolving in history's pages. But it wasn't so. Against all odds, the Jewish people rose from ashes. Already in the 1920s, many Jews had emigrated to Palestine, where they began organizing communities, rebuilding collective life. And after the war, in 1948, something happened that many thought impossible. For the first time in 2,000 years, the world map saw the birth of a new independent Jewish state, Israel. Just 1 year later, in 1949, Israel was accepted as a UN member. It was an unexpected rebirth, a victory of resilience, proof that no extermination attempt can completely erase the identity of a people determined to survive. Suffering and adversities didn't break the Jewish people. On the contrary, they tempered them like steel, forging an unbreakable spirit, an inner strength that became their invisible shield, as resistant as bronze and as deep as a centennial tree's roots. For centuries, they fought for their right to exist in a world that tried time and again to erase them from the map. And now, perhaps we begin to understand why Jews have managed to excel in so many areas of knowledge. Why do they shine in commerce, sciences, arts? It's not magic, not coincidence. It's the fruit of centuries of struggle, discipline, family values, a mentality forged in adversity. But here comes a curious detail. There are certain professions where you'll rarely find a Jew. I'll tell you soon. First, let's talk about the principles this people has developed to not only survive in often hostile societies, but also prosper. First, Jews never give up. If they're forced to abandon a place, they don't lament eternally. They seek another site, perhaps more promising, and begin again. If doors close in one sector, they seek another activity, preferably one no one else has dared venture into. And they don't just open a new business. They put all their effort into making it prosper, into standing out, into making it shine. The Jewish people has also learned throughout history the importance of unity. Solidarity isn't an option. It's a necessity for survival. They help each other, support each other in business, share knowledge. That cohesion is one of their most powerful weapons. And here's a question for reflection. Do you believe thoughts can become reality? Some maintain that our ideas aren't just fantasies, but active forces that shape our lives. According to this theory, when a thought firmly establishes itself in your mind, it begins acting like a magnet, attracting opportunities, people, and situations that bring you closer to your goal. Could it be true? Well, believing or not is a personal decision, but one thing is certain. When you desire something intensely and work tirelessly for it, it seems a superior force opens paths for you. And Jews have this very clear. They believe God is always on their side, that He never abandons them, that even in the worst moments He gives them strength to move forward. Therefore, when something goes wrong, they don't stop to cry for long. They analyze the situation, seek new ways to generate income, reinvent themselves. Isn't that capacity to adapt, to find their place in any corner of the world, admirable? The patience, unity, and constant effort of this people are qualities many could envy. Notice another interesting detail. You'll rarely see a Jew showing off wealth or boasting about success. Jokes and legends circulate about supposed Jewish greed, but perhaps that stinginess is nothing more than prudent money management, a refusal to spend irresponsibly what has been earned with so much effort. Have you ever thought of it that way? When facing problems, Jews don't sink into desperation. They have a book that guides them, the Talmud, a compendium of teachings passed from generation to generation for more than 6 centuries. There they find norms about how to live, how to pray, how to treat children and parents, how to face poverty, and how to prosper. The Talmud, which means teaching, is a life manual that inspires many to stay firm, even in the worst storms. Within its pages is a curious character, a man whose name translates as "everything is for good." This character, even in the most difficult moments, maintained a positive attitude and repeated that everything happening happens for good. Imagine the strength such a mentality can have. believing there are no failures, only experiences that teach, that every stumble is a learning opportunity. My lifelong friend dreamed since childhood of being an architect. She loved imagining buildings, drawing houses in her notebook, dreaming of designing something grand. But there was a problem. Mathematics and technical geometry were her Achilles' heel. No matter how much she studied, numbers and
when time came to take the entrance exam,
wall to scale,
she collapsed.
She failed spectacularly on the math test. It was a devastating blow. There were tears, many tears, and a deep feeling of failure, as if the world had ended. But she decided to give herself a year to recover, study more, and try again. Not to waste time, she temporarily enrolled in medical school, thinking it would be something temporary, just a patch while preparing for her true passion. That year, completely changed her life. Happened. She discovered she was passionate about medicine, that helping people filled her soul. Today, she's one of the best doctors in her region, a respected therapist who has saved countless lives. And I sometimes think, what would have happened if she had passed that math exam? Would she have fulfilled her dream, or would she have missed her true purpose? How often the same happens to us in life. We think an obstacle is the end, but with time we understand it was just a redirection. We all have moments when we feel everything is lost, but if we look from another perspective, maybe it was the best thing that could happen. Sometimes failure is the door to a better life, and we don't see it until much later. Don't you think Jews are right to think everything that happens has a purpose, even the most difficult? They believe tests aren't punishments, but learning opportunities, and that gives them impressive inner strength. Life isn't easy for anyone. That's clear. We all face moments of uncertainty, fear, and loss. What makes the difference is how we decide to react. The Jewish people, after centuries living under constant threat, learned to see every crisis as an opportunity, every change as a new beginning. That mentality isn't just a cultural trait. It's a survival tool, and that's reflected even in how Jews do business. Have you ever dealt with a Jewish entrepreneur? They surprise you from the first moment. They greet you with authentic warmth, look you in the eyes, call you by name, make you feel welcome. Their words are full of kindness, almost as if each encounter were a sacred opportunity. That ability to connect, to create emotional bonds, doesn't arise from nothing. It's a skill cultivated across generations because they know relationships are the foundation of any success. For them, negotiating isn't just talking. It's an art, almost a science. From childhood, they learn that dialogue is key to resolving conflicts, that compromise is more valuable than confrontation. If in a conversation they feel someone isn't interested in working as a team, they don't get frustrated or immediately dismiss them. They keep searching, exploring paths, because they're clear that if they can't find common ground, they won't advance. That mentality is burned into their culture. You can always reach understanding if you search with enough intelligence and patience. Now, I'll ask you a question. Why are Jews so intelligent? The answer isn't in a special gene or genetic coincidence. The key lies in their history. Centuries of persecution taught them that knowledge is power, that learning is surviving. For Jews, study isn't just a tool for progress, it's a matter of dignity. Education is the greatest legacy they can leave their children, and that's why they dedicate every free minute to learning, studying, improving. It's an unwritten but deeply respected principle. Whoever doesn't study doesn't grow, and whoever doesn't grow falls behind. Therefore, in any field, science, medicine, business, or art, Jews don't settle for being good. They want to be the best. It's like an instinct, a way of thinking that passes from generation to generation. But are they really the most intelligent and wealthy? Maybe not in absolute numbers, but yes in attitude, because for them, success isn't a matter of luck. It's the result of effort, discipline, long-term vision, and above all, a mentality that never stops learning. And here comes curious data. There are areas where you'll almost never see a Jew. Professional sports, for example, isn't their terrain. Why might that be? Because physical competitions don't fit their life philosophy, which values mental development and knowledge more. Another field where they're rare is agriculture. Have you wondered why Jews were prohibited from owning land for centuries? It wasn't just an economic limitation, it was social punishment. They closed doors to the countryside, and that marked their history. So when you see a Jew succeed, it's not magic. It's the result of a tradition forged in adversity's fire, of centuries of struggle, of a culture that values knowledge, perseverance, and family. For them, success is work, continuous learning, strategic thinking, adapting, and never giving up. And although many prefer to see arrogance or greed in their success, maybe what they see is simply firm determination to protect what costs them so much to achieve. Because wealth for them isn't just money. It's knowledge, network of contacts, ability to negotiate, foresee risks, and learn from mistakes, even others. They don't believe in luck. They believe in preparation. They believe every difficulty is a springboard. And maybe, just maybe, they believe Yahweh still accompanies them, guiding them through the storm. Whether you want to believe it or not, that's in your hands. But one thing is certain. In this uncertain world, having such a mentality can be the greatest treasure one can have. If this video made you reflect, don't leave without hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who also wants to open their eyes and learn to see the world from another perspective. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can awaken a mentality that transforms lives. See you in the next one.